Good afternoon. Welcome to IPI for today's event on protection through policing, the protective role of UN police in peace operations. My name is Namie Razza. I'm a senior fellow at IPI's Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations and the head of the Protection of Civilians program. IPI's POC program aims at informing policy developments and practice and support member states, the UN Secretariat and missions in their efforts to enhance the delivery of protection of civilians' mandates in the field. In particular, one of the main objectives of our program is to clarify roles and responsibilities of the different actors involved in the implementation of protection mandates for better use of tailored approaches, including armed and unarmed strategies. Protection of civilians is a multidimensional endeavor. It has been defined by the UN along 3 tiers: protection through dialogue and engagement, provision of physical protection, and the establishment of a protective environment. This means that POC, protection of civilians, is not only a question of use of force and physical interposition by military components of peace operations. Civilian components, through the analysis, the human rights work, the engagement with communities, or the support to disarmament and demobilization, also contribute to strengthen short and long-term protection. But beyond military and civilian components, police components can also play a major role in protection and should also fully be integrated in protection strategies. In times of peace, the police is the main actor handling public security and public order, and its core function is often defined by the mantra to serve and protect. However, the comparative advantage of UNPOL in peacekeeping and in protection of civilians in particular remains largely unknown and is often overlooked. This event represents the culmination of IPI's research project on UN police and protection of civilians, the contribution of UN police to POC, with the launch of a policy paper authored by Charles Hunt. Charlie's paper is an essential contribution at a time of reflection on ways to strengthen people-centered and community-oriented approaches in peacekeeping and alternative options to heavy military presence for future peace operations models. His paper provides an in-depth analysis of comparative advantages of police components and specific recommendations on ways to leverage them to enhance POC. So before turning to the panel for a presentation of the paper and an examination of these important questions, I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of Italy, our co-host for the event, and invite the Deputy Permanent Representative, Ambassador Stefano Stefanile, to make opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Although I'm speaking from this lectern, I will not make a solemn and formal speech, so you can feel reassured from that point of view. I will rather make a few informal remarks. And the first thing I want to say is that I'm very pleased and very impressed to see how numerous you are. There is a very good turnout, which I think is evidence that IPI is able to organize events that attract interest and participation. Like many other missions, also the Italian mission has a long history of cooperation with IPI. We did a lot of interesting things in the past, and we are very pleased that we could also cooperate in the organization of this event. And especially this year, which marks the 50th anniversary of IPI, so congratulations on that as well. And the event of today focuses on a very important subject. You know, there is a lot of talking at UN nowadays on peacekeeping in general, especially since the launch of the Action Agenda for Peacekeeping promoted by the Secretary General almost 2 years ago. We discussed this at UN in informal settings, in official settings, but also in informal formats, group of friends, other kind of formats. And many of the member states are also promoting themselves as champions of peacekeeping. But this issue today, the issue that is going to be discussed, is a particular dimension of peacekeeping, and it focuses on UN policing. And UN policing is, in a way, the instrumental factor that establishes the link between peacekeeping and peace building. So in a way, it's at the core of the spirit and philosophy of the reform promoted by the Secretary General in the peace and security pillar, the so-called sustaining peace. So policing on the ground encapsulated in UN missions helps to restore mutual trust among different communities, to favor reconciliation, to protect civilians, and this is the main core of the discussion today. Protecting civilians not only from conflict-related violence, but also from ordinary violence or organized crime or transnational crime. So it's indeed a fundamental function. And we do believe that more attention should be devoted to this issue. I understand there is also an informal group of friends, I think chaired by Germany, which specifically deals with this. And Italy looks at this issue as a very dear subject. As you will probably remember, during our last tenure in the Security Council in 2017, we promoted a resolution that was indeed adopted in November 2017. It's the resolution 2382, which is exactly about policing at UN. And it's, I think, a very comprehensive attempt to touch upon all the different aspects of this important dimension. We also try to provide contributions in terms of police training for UN components. This is mainly done through our COESPO training center in Vicenza, and there is a special role which is played in this regard by our Carabinieri, and among the audience there is our military advisor, who is a general of Carabinieri. And there is also another geographical link, I would say, with the policing at UN. As you may know, the police standing capacity of the UN, together with other standing capacities related to the rule of law work stream, is indeed hosted in Brindisi, in the Global Service Center in Brindisi, that is in Italy. So all this combined explains why we are happy to co-sponsor this event. We are happy to cooperate for the realization of this discussion. So without further ado, we do look forward to the discussion. I've seen the report prepared by Charles Hunt, who was very candid in saying a minute ago to me that this was actually a teamwork, and we were discussing that. So it's a report that highlights the strengths, the advantages of UN policing, but I understand also the challenges, and probably this is the most interesting part we want to discuss. So once again, thank you for coming. Thank you to IPI for being partners in this, and we really hope to enjoy the debate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So let me now introduce our panel today. To my far right, Charles Hunt. Dr. Charles Hunt is the author of IPI's policy paper. He is also a visiting research fellow at the Center for Policy Research at United Nations University and a senior research fellow in the School of Global and Urban and Social Studies at MIT University in Melbourne. Mr. Xiaowen Yang is the Deputy Police Advisor in the Police Division of the United Nations Department of Peace Operations. Ms. Rania Dagash is the Head of the Policy and Best Practices Service in the Division of Policy Evaluation and Training, DPET, at the UN Department of Peace Operations. And Mr. Boniface Rutikanga is the Police Advisor of the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations. So it is with my great pleasure that I first give the floor to Charlie, who will start off by presenting his report and his main findings. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'd like to start by thanking Namie in particular, but IPI for supporting this project, this work, and arranging this event. And happy birthday, by the way, 50th birthday. Also to the Italian Permanent Mission for co-hosting, and also some of the leadership on policing issues in peacekeeping at the Secretariat. Keep up the good work. Most important of all, I'd like to thank all the interviewees, hundreds of them, and also the reviewers of the drafts of this report, whose insight and feedback really enrich this. The paper examines recent experiences of UN police, or UNPOL, in protection of civilians based on fieldwork I did last year in the Central African Republic and in Mali, but also some insights from other work I've done, other fieldwork in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as meetings here with colleagues in the police division and the Secretariat across the road. The key takeaway that I'd like you all to have today are some of the things Namie opened with, but police in peacekeeping have always contributed to protection of civilians since the emergence of that mandate. But more recently, they've been thrust more onto the front lines of some of these efforts in places like Central African Republic, Darfur, Congo, Mali, and South Sudan. And these are missions characterized by proliferation of criminal armed groups, threatening civilians at times, and often in densely populated urban environments, including IDP camps, something I'll come back to. Second key point, that police provide unique capabilities and expertise, arguably ingrained in this idea that police's inherent function is to serve and protect. Third, missions, as Namie said, have generally undervalued or overlooked some of these protective roles of police, often relying more on militarized approaches to protection. And having recently had my second baby, it occurred to me that the police in protection debates are a bit like a second child. It's a bit like this second child syndrome. An afterthought, perhaps not planned ideally, and often in the shadows of the first, the thing that came first. And so I think police are making significant contributions. This is the key point. But there's numerous challenges to doing more in that space. I think it's particularly timely because to examine these issues further, because there's a belief growing in popularity among some member states and many UN officials that police can increasingly act as this bridge, perhaps as the force is drawing down in cases where missions are transitioning. And I'm thinking specifically about the idea of the post-UNAMID footprint here. So it's an important time to reflect on this. Very quickly, the report first outlines what I found to be the key contributions and perceived comparative advantages of police in protection of civilians. Second, it identifies some of the challenges to police protection efforts. And drawing on those lessons, the final section proposes a number of recommendations that hopefully can assist in improving police protection efforts going forward. With my remaining time, I'll touch on 4 of the main key contributions or comparative advantages, and then try and spend a bit more time, as the ambassador said, on the challenges. So 4 key contributions where maybe the police have either comparative advantage or at least are an important complement to the military and their civilian counterparts. So first, when violence does not involve the sustained use of firearms or military weaponry, UNPOL are often more appropriately skilled and trained than the military to conduct operations to tackle those threatening civilians. So an example of this is the interjection operations against criminal gangs in Central African Republic, operations to arrest anti-Balaka, responsible for violations of international human rights law inside IDP camps in 2018 is a great example. Second, the second key contribution, UNPOL are often better placed than the military to play a protective role in deterring violent acts against civilians. So the patrols inside the protection of civilian sites in South Sudan is one example. Again, the IDP camps in Central African Republic are an area where both short and long-range patrols in and around these camps can be a deterrent effect. The third key area is that UNPOL are well positioned in ways that their colleagues are often not, to partner with a range of others to protect civilians. This kind of idea of a more indirect contribution to protection. So firstly, with national law enforcement agencies, their relationship, their partnership there through capacity building to help host governments, firstly realize their primary responsibility to protect their own population, a key point around peacekeeping, but secondly also to build the capacity to tackle impunity. The second key constituency is the local population, and I'll spend a little more time on this one because it's so important, I think. Through the community policing approach, there's 2 key benefits that police bring. Firstly, the increased engagement with local populations that police can have. They often get out of vehicles, unlike some of their colleagues in the mission, foot patrols that allow them to get off the main roads into communities and strike up relationships, build trust and confidence with local populations. It's a real potential comparative advantage. And the second area here is that police are able, through this approach, to work with what is already there. They can recognize existing strengths, self-protection mechanisms, and empower communities to participate in and own, this idea of ownership, but not national ownership, local or in-placed ownership of the production of a protective environment that's more sustainable. Examples such as working with community watch groups and the customary authorities inside IDP camps and POC sites, again here. And the last group is the rest of the mission and the UN system itself. So I won't go into all the details, but we can all think of mission-wide efforts like the joint protection teams, the joint assessment missions that police play an important role in. So the fourth area of key contributions is their enabling potential. Police can support the military, for example, through providing police functions during joint operations. The Joint Task Force in Bangui, military commanded, but with a significant police component, which often provides support in arrest and detention, searching, handing over to host authorities, things that the military are not well trained or best placed to do. But the police also support a whole range of the civilian components of the mission. One set of examples is around information sharing. So I heard lots of examples where the police were supporting the Human Rights Division to jointly conduct investigations. That's one area they can share and bring information, but also women and children's protection advisors who often do not have presence in field sites far away. The police often do and can contribute to feeding into the MARA and the MRM, these reporting and monitoring mechanisms. So if they're the four key contributions, I'll finish with touching on four key challenges. So despite all these contributions, police face plenty of challenges. These four are just a kind of clustering of some of the main ones. First, I think despite all the recent development of policy and guidance, and there's been some great efforts on that recently, but nevertheless, UNPOL on the ground and on the front lines still lack clarity on the scope of the mandate, I think. And this is particularly acute when it comes to the question of what it means to use all necessary means, because don't forget, police are also authorized invariably under Chapter 7 in these mandates. What does it mean to use all necessary means to protect civilians when they don't have an executive mandate? There's a series of questions that the report goes into. I don't have time to explain that further. Perhaps we can in the question and answer after. The second big challenge is that as with many other areas of peacekeeping, the police work on protection is not always well coordinated. So there's challenges around the Joint Task Force in Bangui with the military police coordination during joint operations. When the lines between criminal and military threats are blurry, when there's the potential to escalate quickly between those two domains, it's very difficult for the police to remain operating within their directives on the use of force and not be challenged to overstep or make difficult choices in that sense. So that's the second key challenge. The third key set of challenges around partnerships. I've talked about it as one way that police can really add to protection and enable things, but it also has some risks. So the partnerships with local communities and host states can be problematic if it increases the risk of doing more harm than good. The examples here are when it comes to communities in places like Mali, where the mission is a target for some armed groups. Their proximity to populations can imperil those communities. It can expose them to collateral damage. Secondly, in places like Central African Republic, where locals have faced reprisals for collaborating with the UN, who are quite understandably by some perceived as partial in their support for host governments. When it comes to those host governments, the risks are associated, I think, with the more technical approach to capacity building with the host state police, which perpetuates rather than transforms politicized security sectors. This arguably can entrench and leave populations exposed to further abuse by predatory states that the missions often get trapped in partnership with. So the fourth and final area of key challenges is around this perennial issue around capabilities, capacities, and tools, but specifically around the ones needed to protect civilians. Three key examples. First, there's an insufficient quantity, but also quality and flexibility of UNPOL assets and resources. Firstly, to cover the types of areas of operation, areas of responsibility, like the POC sites in South Sudan, but also to respond rapidly to hotspots, being able to move assets quickly, to be agile, to protect through projection. The second area is that and this is a cultural issue that sits across many of the things I've raised. There's simply not enough police voice in planning, both at headquarters and in the field, but secondly, influence in decision making. This is referring back to the second child syndrome, UNPOL are often subordinated in many of the mechanisms and processes within the culture. And the last example here is that, and I think this is really important and feeds back on the others, that UNPOL don't have adequate monitoring and evaluation to inform the planning, but also to gauge the impact of the activities that they are doing to protect civilians. Many things which we intuitively and we hear are having a big effect, but we don't, they don't, and we don't really have the systems to do it. So in conclusion, these and many other challenges highlighted in the report reveal that while there's significant contributions by police in the current portfolio of missions, protection of civilians is still not really in the bloodstream of the police on the ground at all levels. Police can do a lot more to leverage these comparative advantages that I've laid out in the report and strengthen their contributions, direct action, but also indirectly. The recommendations offer, as I said, hope that can help UNPOL in meeting the growing expectations for their role, but I'll leave it on this note that I think it's ever more important because this current zeitgeist to see policing as a potential panacea to all the questions we have around transitions and thinking through what peace operations may look like in the future if we're facing the end of the era of multi-dimensional peacekeeping. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Namie.
Thank you, Charlie. I think it's very interesting how you describe police components and police, UN police in general, has this bridge builder in a way. And the central aspect of police work is also to build these partnerships and this inclusive approach, but that can also be the inherent challenge in their work in non-permissive environments. And I really like what you mentioned about the lack of maybe strength in the planning and decision-making and the need to give a clearer voice to police in all these processes. And I think, Shawen, it would be interesting to have your perspectives on, well, first, the contribution of UNPOL to POC, but also how can we ensure this greater level of integration of police considerations in POC strategies? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Namie, and thanks to IPI for organizing this event. Of course, thanks the support from Peacekeeping Missions of Italy. It is an honor to be invited here today on behalf of UN Police Devisor, who planned to join as a panelist, but was caught on duty travel at the last minute yesterday. So I will speak to represent his view as well as mine. Now, first, congratulations to Charlie for completing the research study, which I read twice with great interest, and already publishing this report at a critical time when peacekeeping is facing many challenges, and particularly the effectiveness of POC is being questioned in several missions by the civilians whom peacekeepers are deployed to protect. This report is also timely released to allow us, as practitioners as well as policymakers, and all stakeholders in and outside the house to reflect on best practices, draw lessons learned, understand the challenges, and evolving context for POC, which always lies in the center of peacekeeping operations and ultimate objective to achieve, and also explore opportunities related to our POC work, as well as increasing important role of future UN policing in this regard. As you are aware, the mission of United Nations Police is to enhance international peace and security by supporting member states in conflict, post-conflict, and other crisis situations to realize effective, efficient, representative, responsive, and accountable police service that serve and protect the population. And our vision is to build a police service that is modern, agile, flexible, transparent, accountable, mission-focused, people-centered, and rights-based. I think most of Charlie's findings and arguments in his report echoes the UNPOL mission statement and the vision. And just for your information, as of January 2020, there were more than 8,700 UNPOLs from 70 peacekeeping police contributing countries deployed in 9 peacekeeping operations and 7 special political missions, and 17 of them are women officers. So on-pole policing is defined as a function of interim substitute or partially substitute of a law enforcement responsible for the prevention, detection, and investigation of crime, the protection of persons and property, and the maintenance of public order and safety. It is also defined as a part of governance and service that provide some administrative functions, management, and provide support for civilians in need. There's no difference actually with any sovereign country or for everyday policing, yet the UNPOL is only legitimized only by the Security Council resolution to operate in the host country. In most countries, police is considered a service instead of a force, with a distinct civilianized nature. So policing must be entrusted to civil servants who are members of a police or law enforcement agencies within a legal framework based on rule of law. And the police and other law enforcement officials are obligated to respect and protect human rights, and as part of their training and the oath they make when they are recruited. I was pleased to see also Charlie's acknowledgement of United Nations police contribution across all three tiers of POC strategies. And that is a point that was equally recognized by the Secretary General in his 2016 and 2018 reports on UN policing, which reads, United Nations police play a key role in the protection of civilians, bringing to bear skills that complement those of the military or civilian components in providing physical protection and establishing a protective environment. It is now widely recognized that the increasingly critical role of UN police in the conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace building, and peace sustainment across all spectrum of peace, security, human rights, and development pillars, and also both in mission and non-mission settings, and not only triggers the deployment of peace operations due to the breakdown of law and order, but also set the criteria of mission transition and the successful exit strategy. There's another logical sequence of three tiers of POC, as usually argued by our police advisor, Mr. Carrijo, that everyone has no doubt to the primary responsibility of POC by the host state. Therefore, the first tier of protection should be the host state police and security forces. And UN police is the second tier to substitute or support when host state police is unable or fail to do so. And the UN military is the third tier to intervene only when the level and extent of violence reach the level requiring military response, and should hand back to police when situation resumes to normal and eventually taken over by host state again, which is the time for mission exit. And this is the cycle. I fully concur with your typology of UN police as a compiler, deterrent, enabler, and a partner of national counterparts of local communities, and finally, a partner of other mission components. I would also like to add perhaps UN police as a promoter, because UN police work greatly to sensitize and promote international human rights norms among the host state and the civilians, and in compliance with HRDDP when implementing its mandated tasks. I believe that partnership elements offers much room and opportunity for both police division here in New York, as well as the UN police components in the field missions to address some of the challenges, as you mentioned in your study. And with respect to ambiguous mandate, policy, and guidance, this is an ongoing thinking on prioritizing and sequencing Security Council mandates, including possible interaction between the Secretary and the member states, could perhaps help attain more nuanced language. And of course, I believe Lanya will further comment on this. But I do feel the same dilemma of different interpretations of POC mandates when it comes to certain mission context and some scenarios, which leads to the justification both for actions or inactions when they are required to respond. Further, in our meeting with the heads of police component in November last year, we had committed ourselves to systematically to integrate knowledge management as a new system within UN police into our daily work. And our big achievement is that we have been focusing on the operationalization of the Strategic Guidance Framework for International Policing, or SGF, which is the fundamental doctrine that's recently developed for UN policing to ensure a common understanding of good practices and good case examples, including related to POC. When it comes to coordination and coherence, I take note of your suggestion to develop mission-specific tactical level SOPs, clarifying the roles and the responsibility between the military and police components, and building on the recently completed the combined guideline on military and police coordination mechanism. And this is exactly what the SOP requests, and instructions have already been given to the police commissioners in the fields. In addition, priority is also given to strengthen integrated planning, joint operation, assessment, and footprint across the mission components as part of an action plan to improve safety of peacekeeper and contribute to proactive and coordinated strategy on POC. On the holistic approach of rule of law, I believe GFP is a useful platform as we continue to do so. And OROSI is also developing a synergized vision to formulate a common OROSI rule vision through a dedicated retreat recently. And I'm looking forward to close strategic partnership with the UN country teams and other entities as a system-wide service provider. And the Secretary General also noted that protection of civilians is not only about physical protection, but equally about helping and supporting host state police. And we have done so in the past in many missions. As evidenced in some successful missions like in Côte d'Ivoire, Haiti, Liberia, Timor-Leste, the potential impact of our work is greatest when UN policing contributes to effectively building the will and ability of host state police service and other law enforcement agencies to provide protection as a long-term solution and ultimate objective of a given POC mandate. And on the capacities, I fully concur that there are a lot of challenges as well as opportunities for us to pursue. As I just mentioned, we have SGF as a framework to recruit skillful individual police officers in 55 skill sets. We have adopted the SOP on the assessment and evaluation of FPU performance, and we have implemented the SG's gender parity strategy to increase female police officers. And we have done a lot of efforts in that regard in order for AMPO to be deployed to more effectively operate on a community-oriented, intelligence-led, gender-responsive policing and support the host police to be more professional and accountable in the delivery of protection service. Last but not least, there are many platforms, opportunities for us to pursue. We are organizing the 3rd UN Chief of Police Summit in June this year. This will be another the highest level police summit around globally to elaborate how AMPO's role can be adopted and to support the POC efforts. And of course, today's discussion is definitely paving a way forward of unpacking some dilemmas and bringing valuable thoughts to enhance POC strategy as a whole. Last point, congratulate 50th anniversary of IPI, and also mentioning this year is also the 60th anniversary for UN deployment of UN policing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and happy anniversary. Thank you for sharing with us the latest innovations and initiatives in terms of strengthening the work of UN police and trying to revise guidance to make that contribution even clearer and more effective in the field. So with that, I'll turn to Rania. Rania, the protection of civilians policy of DPO was revised a few months ago and emphasizes the integrated and multidimensional approach of protection. So maybe what are the next steps? How should policy and practice further focus on UNPOL for the protection of civilians? Thanks.
Thanks, Namie, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to be back at IPI, and I'd like to thank them, of course, and the Permanent Mission of Italy for having us today. And also to not just thank Charlie, but agree with everything that he has said, as well as the Deputy Police Commissioner, too. I have 8 points I'd like to highlight, one of which was the thanking. And then I have 3 points to start with. I have 3 examples to anchor some of these points that Charlie and the Police Commissioner have been sharing on how police have operated in some of our missions, that shows that not only are they second children, they're actually hustlers. Second children are hustlers by nature. They have to cope. And how they've embraced all 3 tiers of our POC policy and strategy across our missions. And then I have a qualifier on the context in which police operate, and then our own commitment on how we bring these things together. So I better start if they sound so many now. It's 20 years since the first POC resolution was established. So since then, I think it's been a considerable growth in our police presence in our missions. We have 9,000, and I just want to say this to lay the context of the scale of the police contribution in our missions. Roughly 9,000 across 7 missions, peacekeeping missions that have a POC mandate. And of course, our approach is a whole of mission approach in protection of civilians. It basically works based on cooperation between civilians, police, and military. And bringing the 3 together is how we've built the revised policy that we just issued in 2019. And we're also working on a handbook now that places emphasis on the importance of this integrated approach that you referred to, Namie, and how important it is to remain coordinated in how we protect civilians together. So we highlight also in this process not just the criticality of the police component in POC, but emphasize the community orientation of policing, the patrolling of our vulnerable communities and RDP sites, the advising capacities that you extend to national police service. And I say service, sir, not force, just to clarify, and also to make sure that we are using the right language, and in restoring and promoting public safety. So we couldn't agree more with your findings, Charlie. It is undervalued, it is undertapped, and it is often overlooked. But I am also heartened by the fact that in us acknowledging the importance of the 3 components coming together and integrating our protection of civilians approach, there is an increasing recognition about the importance of the police component. And I think you start to see that also in some of the examples that I'll share. The 3 tiers in protection of civilians known to many of you, so bear with me please as I repeat. The police contribute to dialogue and engagement, which is fundamentally a political role. And many don't seem to think of the police as a first, go-to in that. But the police help us promote and advocate protection priorities with national and local stakeholders. And that fundamentally contributes to their role in dialogue and engagement at a political level. So it's a significant factor. It's often done in formal but also informal settings as they build these trust relationships with their counterparts. So it's a very important part to remember that it's not just the political affairs officers who contribute to that. It's also our police component, most significantly because of the special relationship that they establish often with the communities and with the forces, with their counterparts. So that's a very important thing I wanted to flag. UNPOL have been extremely successful, despite all rumors you may hear otherwise, in preventing outbreaks of violence between host state police and political demonstrators in election context. DRC is a very good example of that, and so was Mali, actually. So good to just reinforce some of the positive things that the role of the police can highlight in these contexts. In the second tier, which is the physical protection tier, and the one that's most obvious, really, our FPUs, of course, respond to threats to public order, and they help to establish the protective environment. And that's the role they're most known for, so I don't need to elaborate more on that. But tier 3, which is the capacity building of the host state and the law enforcement services, is also one we don't often talk about and highlight. And I think it's one that is fundamental and critical to what our UNPOL does in those missions, and is the legacy that remains for most part. So you can see that in their response to public order issues or conducting joint patrols with national police or gendarmerie, it is that function of showing them how to do the business better and more responsibly is what we leave behind, really. So I wanted to flag those 3 points before I now go to the stories. So in CAR, we have a context where beyond Bangui, the UNPOL basically act unilaterally to maintain order, and they do so to substitute for national police in most places outside Bangui. And they're authorized to take urgent temporary measures, which include arrest and detention at times in the absence of national services. In South Sudan, UNPOL have a full responsibility, basically, to maintain safety and security inside the POC sites that we have across South Sudan. And they're home to over 200,000 IDPs, as some of you know. So they're on the front lines, really, of direct action and extension of physical protection from violence. And I just wanted to share those to conjure the picture, really, of what some of our UNPOL do in the missions. The second example is in Gao in northern Mali, and where the relationship between the community-oriented policing model that enhances the relationship and interaction between the mission and the local populations is most stark. I would argue that the role of UNPOL in building trust between national security forces and the civilian populations in Gao in the north is undeniable, that they have managed to create networks that bring in information sharing and that allows both the local authorities actually and the local population to get information and take decisions together, has reinforced the relationship between the local populations and the national forces. And that's directly the work of UNPOL in Mali, and is, again, something that we don't often talk about. The third story, which I thought is interesting, is actually in Haiti. And that's in a transition context where the role of the police is increasingly getting the limelight, as more and more peacekeeping missions in recent years have gone through different transitions. And as we, as a peacekeeping mission, withdraw and hand over to a country team presence often or to another mission, there are residual tasks that were, of course, entrusted to the mission that are considered on what do we do with them and how do we transition them to our other UN partners. So in Haiti, where it's organized crime, gangs, and intercommunal violence more than it is armed conflict, UNPOL supported the Haitian National Police in building capacity, basically. And it was crucial to the ability of the government to fully take on the primary responsibility to protect civilians. And, you know, you get at the end the ceremony as the mission is closing, highlights of some of that. But again, it goes to my first point that a lot of the work that many of our UNPOL colleagues don't really get the immediate effect of what it is they're doing, but it's certainly something that I think in a few years in Haiti we will be recognizing. So with those 6 points, I just wanted to qualify something quick, and that is that despite everything that I've said and some of these stories that we've shared and what my colleagues have said, we still have to be relatively context specific in our approach to how we do policing. It depends on the type of threat. It depends on the tools that we use and and how we address those threats. And I think it's important to qualify that sometimes you hear the trend, oh, if we can't get enough military, let's just add a few more FBUs. It's really important to say that the police and military are suited for different protection functions. And the police, even FBUs, should not just be seen as a cheaper or easier solution for peacekeeping. And I think that's an important, if you take nothing away, take that away with you, please, today. And that they are a very effective mode in transitions for us and a tool. And it isn't quick and it isn't fast, but it definitely is an investment that is worth putting in place. My final point, which is my commitment and the commitment of our division in policy and linking these things together, as Namie flags my minute, is that we definitely will work with the police division and have been to review the guidelines for the police and protection of civilians. Noting the recent adoption, of course, of our policy, there's a need to update and reflect the revisions of that and address the evolving peacekeeping context in the police doctrine. And we know that and we're working on it. The training materials for police, both pre-deployment and in mission training, is another area that we are investing currently, and we hope that we're able to update those accordingly. And finally, we're also working on mission-specific, basically scenario-based trainings, where in CAR has been our big success, where we bring the police, we bring the military, we bring the civilians, we look into who the main armed groups are, what the context is, what the issue is, and we found that this context-specific trainings are a lot more impactful in the understanding of our colleagues in the police and the military and our civilian colleagues on how to do protection of civilians together. And we hope to roll more of that out across our missions. And with that, I thank you.
Thanks, Rania. I think it's very an important point to insist, as Charlie already did as well, on the fact that UN police is not a panacea. It's not interchangeable with military components. All of these actors have specific functions and protective functions and specific comparative advantages that need to be leveraged depending on the situation. And I think with that, maybe Boniface, it's interesting, I mean, from the perspective of Rwanda, who is one of the main police contributors to peacekeeping, I think the second police contributor, to maybe bring some perspectives as well on what the comparative advantages in the field, because you also have military components and contributions to peacekeeping. You have both experiences, and you're also a champion of protection of civilians. So I think really, from your perspective of a contributor, what should be learned from these different advantages? And also if you could talk about, I think there's a specific recommendation that Charlie makes in the report about the Kigali principles and how also they should be applied to police, maybe augmented to include more policing in commitments of member states. So with that, I'll give you the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful discussion, and I thank Charlie for interesting report he came up with. Let me first say something about policing experience. I'm a serving police officer and police advisor at the mission, and who happened to serve in the peacekeeping mission. Before someone becomes a peacekeeper, you need to be first a police officer, uniformed personnel. You need to be a police officer or military officer. So in this perspective, I'm talking about the police officer, police peacekeeping officer. So you need to be a first police officer who trained and raised up in a different policing context. Then you need to undergo pre-deployment training, United Nations pre-deployment training, that makes you become a UN police officer. Normally, pre-deployment trainings 1 to 3 months, depending on if it's IPO, could be 1 month. If it's FPU, it's a 3 month. These are mandatory. Specialized teams also are part of the IPOs, so they need to also to undergo pre-deployment training. So now the question is this pre-deployment really enough to equip you with the knowledge, skills, energy, dynamism to serve in such challenging situation in the field? So this is something that needs also to be explored further to see if this training is really enough to equip someone to serve in such challenging situation, foreign country, different culture, with a lot of complexities that have been described by previous speakers. I served in one of the missions. I served in UNMID in 2012 and 2013. I underwent through pre-deployment training, and having served for quite a number of years back home as a police officer. But if I may be honest, what you encounter on the ground, you may not necessarily find it reflected from the pre-deployment you got. So at some point, you need to use your own way of adapting to the current situation. So there is a level of maturity and understanding that is required from either member of FPU or IPO or specialized team member, sometimes to be able to fit in that United Nations policing field. So I just wanted to highlight that, but
So you become a hustler.
yes.
Yeah.
And what do we meet when we went to the peacekeeping missions? It is common knowledge. During and after armed violence, what you find is intercommunal violence, sexual and gender-based violence, it's criminality, including criminal gangs. Of course, these are challenges that you encounter. Of course, plus for FPU, regular and daily patrols, public order management, and other tasks that are provided by the mission. So these challenges, they are supposed to be reflected in a pre-deployment training that we need to be receiving. They are reflected, but they are talked about. But the scenario and the circumstances under which they are really happening, this is something different, because this is something you go to experience when you reach the ground. So these are things that we are confronted with. And in most cases, as Charlie highlighted in his report, when you don't have executive mandate, it is even, there is a limitation on how you deal with them. For example, in CAL, you arrest, let me, before going to arresting and detaining, talk something about policing. When you arrest, make a case file, prosecute, and you have the suspect charged, that's success of policing. But if you don't have this happening, the whole process, the entire process of justice happening, it is discouraging and disappointing. And this is one of the limitations UN police is having the mission. This is what we, PCCs, our personnel, are encountering, because you may arrest, you see charges, but you don't have that executive mandate to come up with the case file and proceed with the prosecution for various reasons. Because we understand in that situation, there's breakup of rule of law. There is corruption. System is not working sometimes. So it's too hard for UN police officer to arrest someone, hand over to the local authorities, and the next day you find him coming back in the protection of civilian sites, and probably victims, you could feel how they feel when they does that. Of course, with a lot of threats. They come with a lot of threats. And so if it looks like that, then for UN policing, I think it is discouraging again to arrest if there is another case happening. These are the real challenges that is really happening that need to be redefined, and mandates that are coming out need to consider all these situations. Of course, we understand that host nations is a primary responsible to undertake some of these tasks. But mandates doesn't define, of course, they are not even aware when the host nation authorities will fail to comply with what they're required to do. And when UN police will be able to begin from there. So this kind of complication, this kind of situation, really it complicates how we conduct our business in the field mission. So let me talk something very interesting. This is based on the second tier of protective. Protection through dialogue and engagement. Policing is about interaction. And if you are looking for lasting and sustainable peace, then interaction, engagement, conversation, dialogue is very important. So police as enabler, actually it's enabling to this political process, because this is where police get to understand the nitty and gritties, all these problems that are happening on the grassroots level. You get to understand them and inform high authorities through this interaction. So this is one of the very important role that is really defining what UN policing is doing. But now let me come to the skill set and the capabilities and the experience required. During my services in Darfur, by that time, I was 10 years in policing experience, with policing experience. And when we approached this local police officer, he had served 30 years. So when you are discussing with him, first he has this superiority complex where he shows that, what do you come to teach me? What are you explaining to me? So meaning that during the selection and the recruitment of IPOs, we need also to consider the issue of experience, seniority, who is able to confront arguably in arguments and facts with the host nation's police, because they have this feeling that also they can do. And they don't accept some people they perceive to be junior to be able to teach them what to do. So meaning that you need to be very tactful and very good in your approach. So let me just come back to what we do in view of implementing protection of civilians. Before we go to implement on the field, because we need also to prepare. We need to generate. In police, we have standard SGF. These are guidelines that have 4 areas: operations, command, administration, and capacity building. These are the area that informs our generation, people with skill sets under that areas. Then we train, we have policies, we deploy, then we get feedback. What we do, we normally ask those coming from the mission, what did you experience? This informs our training. This informs what should be equipment that we're looking for. But again, equipment we normally deploy depends on SUR. This is state of unity requirement. So this is how we conduct our training. This is how we identify our problems. Of course, with the cooperation with Secretariat, Policy Division, and feedback from mission. So what I may recommend to this regard, I think triangle cooperation, PCCs, Secretariat, and Security Council, we need to be discussing details of these mandates and the requirements that are required to implement them. Kigali principles need to redefine the role of police in this. I talked of how one of the areas of the aspect of Kigali principles says force generation. Force generation, automatically police is out. We need to come up with tailored training, context-tailored training, which is really very, very important. Then we need to identify right capabilities, right skill sets. But the most important thing that I don't know how to describe it, and I don't know how we're gonna train about it, it's the right mindset. You might have a lot of capabilities required, security squad, but if no right mindset, nothing will be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this experience. Thanks. I think, well, it's important to highlight these gaps in training and in the clarity of mandates and guidance, especially when police officers, UN police officers, will have to face situations like the host state police threatening its own population and this kind of very important dilemmas on the ground. So with that, I think this is a very rich discussion, and I'm sure that there will be questions from the audience. So I would like to open the floor. If you have any question for our panelists, please raise your hand and introduce yourself and your organization. I will take a few questions now. So I have one in the back, one here on my right. So yes.
Hello, my question is to Dr. Charlie. My name is Wesley. I'm an intern at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I wanted to ask you about your experience in Mali. I think over the last couple of days, we heard that the president of Mali said that he's willing to negotiate with jihadist groups to at least bring about stability in the country. So in light of those recent developments, what do you foresee, or what impact do you see for the role of UN police? Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Emmanuel Roux. I'm the permanent observer of Interpol to the UN. In the police for 30 years, in the UN with 5 years. First of all, thank you, because you spoke beautifully of the police, about the police work, being police officer or not police officer, thank you. And it's obvious that the rationale about the added value of police work in peacekeeping and in general is really increasing in the recent years. I have kind of two questions. The first one is a point that has been addressed by Dr. Hunt on the military to police cooperation, exchange of information, how you can bring intelligence into evidence. Does that work in the UN system today, and what could be done to increase that? And the other one I haven't heard about, the threats to population are usually cross borders. I mean, they come from outside of the country. What do you think of the capacity of UNPOL to work on police cooperation, and of course the link with the Interpol National Central Bureau? Thank you very much.
Yes, another question in the back.
Hi, thank you for this. My name is Faraz Siddiqui. I'm from UN Office for Counterterrorism. My question is, in terms of peace operations, which geographical areas will you guys feel that it's the most challenging? Thank you.
Do you want to maybe be more precise in your question in terms of counterterrorism, but more?
So like in terms of peace operations, when you say of UN police, which geographical or African countries are the most challenging to go in, or to go in for their operations?
Of environments, theaters of operation.
Yeah.
I see. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Colonel Peter Vohradik from the Czech mission. I would like to ask my police advisor colleague. You have talked about the different challenges of the police in UN missions. One challenge that you have not addressed is the interaction between the police and the military component. If you are able to share some of that experience, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
So 2 questions on military and police cooperation. If there's not a second round of questions and answers, does anybody want to intervene now, in case we don't have enough time? All right, and maybe I'll add to this list of questions. I also have a reflection on the community-oriented policing. And it seems to me that it's quite interesting how actually, yes, the police is supposed to be this particular actor which is really good at community approaches and community-oriented engagement. Police forces, when they're deployed in their countries, are almost naturally community-oriented because the community is theirs, they come from this community. And I'm wondering, how can we translate this sense of community engagement in the context of international deployment, where maybe the communities are not so familiar with these police forces, and there's not a natural link there. So how do you see that in UN police work? So with that, maybe Charlie, if you want to start?
Sure, thanks very much, Namie. Thank you everyone for your attention and engagement and the set of questions. I won't try and touch on everything. Maybe I'll start at the end, because Namie, your point, I think, it does come up in the report where it emphasizes the importance of cultural affinity, language skills. It's captured in the idea of the right, appropriate capabilities and capacities. But the example I use is from Bria in Central African Republic, where I saw it was extremely important that the Ivorian IPO, the police officer, not part of a formed unit, had built significant relationships with members of the community in the IDP camp, but also in the town controlled by rebels. And it was in no small part because of his ability to mediate across culture, both the linguistic, the access that comes with the French language, which was, at least a shared language, but the cultural affinity. And it was about the everyday insecurities that people faced in the camp. Sure, there was anti-Balaka inside. Sure, there was ex-Balaka outside. But there was also the interpersonal insecurities that involve a range of culturally specific practices and facets. So the one that most people used as the example was the role of the spirits in the ancestral realm. People saw that as hugely important to the way that they engaged on an everyday basis. If the spirits were not appeased and the ancestral realm wasn't calm, then life within the camp wouldn't be either. The ability of the IPOs to understand that, to speak on those terms, and to try nevertheless to engage in ways that held up the principles that the UN brings through missions was really important. So certainly I think there's a case to be made. IPI has done some great work on the impact of having more regional neighbors contributing to missions, and I think there's something to be said to look at the police specifically on that because of this community engagement side. Then back to the first question, Wesley, thank you very much for your question. I haven't been following Mali as much as you, clearly, in the last few days, but I think there's a broader point here which connects the very micro level up to the macro level that you're talking about. If what you're describing is true, then what that speaks to is a political process, a political strategy for the mission that is more inclusive and more expansive. It involves parties to conflict who were previously not at the table. That's important for police because it's part of the political strategy, it's part of the exit strategy. This is back to the conversation about transitions. On an everyday basis, it would change the way police do their work on security sector reform, how they engage with other partners, who's involved in these mechanisms to secure people's everyday existence. It would have very practical implications for the everyday work, but it's also this kind of more meta, macro level thing where the mission would be looking at a different set of objectives because of the political strategy. And Namie herself has written an excellent paper, I think, on the importance of aligning political strategies with POC strategies. This is a key area. I've probably said enough already. Can I just say something very briefly on the others? The pointed question about military-police cooperation was whether the intelligence that the police gather through an intelligence-led policing model can be used, is used within the mission context to inform the planning. I think I saw great examples both in Mali and CAR where that had happened. I think there's also clearly blockages and there's cultural issues within missions about who information can be shared with, who it cannot. It's particularly difficult for the police to share information on their counterparts. There's really a dilemma there about the police, the UN police, giving information on these people that they have to have a really strong relationship with. So there's tensions, but that's peacekeeping. There's always tensions and dilemmas. I think it's an area that can be addressed through some technical fixes. There's SOPs now between the Human Rights Division and the Police Division I think this was in CAR, where they developed something in that mission. It was really effective. It was really confidence building between the two, but they're just small steps along the way. The most challenging geographic area for some of the reasons you mentioned for UN peacekeeping, I think it's just probably a one-word answer: Mali.
Thanks, Charlie. Sharon, do you want to?
Well, thanks. Just a few more comments in addition to what Charlie has elaborated. Maybe I think AMPO, as we already mentioned, the unique or comparative advantage is the outreach to the community through community-oriented policing, and also we're also developing intelligence-led policing through targeted engagement with the counterparts, supporting them, and also generating information from those engagements, and also to support missions early warning and situational awareness. I think that also indirectly contribute to the mediation with the criminal gangs, including terrorist groups, jihadists, whatever, and also police, through police capacity building, it is also contributing to the investigation of those criminal activities behind the scene. And on the military police, as many have been said, there's a lack of clarity, actually, whether it's lies in the mandate or in the SOP, that the different division of labor and also the area of responsibility often always overlapping. And of course, we have been developing our own guidelines for AMPO on the POC, and we are going to revise it as a part of the SGF manual development. And also, we are developing a targeted training mechanism, and AMPO training architecture is being developed across pre-deployment, in-mission, and even after-mission training to better prepare peacekeepers with the skill sets and also with the operational readiness, the performance accountability, and also elsewhere. I think the most challenging for POC, I think apart from MINUSMA, I think for AMPO, it is also challenging in AMIS, which AMPO operate within the POC sites and exercise de facto executive mandates within the POC sites. And in the mission of UNISFAR in Abyei, there's no national police force. So AMPO is actually substituting the local authority in maintaining public order and the investigation of crimes. And also, I think also one of the strategy AMPO is developing is, again, a comprehensive management of crime, and also community outreach program through some non-law enforcement functions by engaging with the local community to build trust between the authority and the police. One example, in MONUSCO, the police are helping local communities in helping them to find the jobs, to help them to how to make a liquid soap, for example, is a very successful story in MINUSCA. Our gender affairs officer has contributed a lot, and also the community is very, very welcome those AMPO initiatives. Just one small example to elaborate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Rania?
I think actually most of the questions have been taken. Just to my colleague from counterterrorism, I think all of the contexts are challenging, to be honest. I wouldn't say Mali. I think each one of them is challenging in a different way. And I wouldn't be able to qualify and tell you this one is more difficult than the other. We can definitely speak offline if you wish as to what the challenges from each one are. I think that's it.
Thanks, Rania.
Thank you. Colleague military advisor asked me, yes, I skipped this because I was warned to be so quick. Yes, as the PCC and the TCC, the interaction between military and the police is very good. There's no problem about that. If I may give an example, like in Kagabandoro, where Rwanda deploys the FPU, in the outskirts of the protection of civilian sites, there is a Pakistan battalion. So the responsibilities and duties are really defined. So what is really happening there is between the relationship, personal relationship, other work relationship is clearly defined. Maybe coming back to the report, what is really happening on the ground, it's like police has big role to play on the ground than military when it comes to engagement, when it comes to go across 3 tiers of protection of civilians. So, but as it stands now, the relationship is quite good on the ground. There's no problem of that. Community engagement, given the international nature of the personnel coming the mission, it's quite challenging. Again, I will refer to my experience. I had a team of 10 from different parts of the world. But there is time we would confront some opinion leaders in the camp. Sometimes they would speak to us, sometimes they would not speak. And you ask, why are you not cooperating to interact with us? Then behind the scene, we realized that there was someone they were not comfortable with. So it's really challenging sometimes. These are the small things and reality that may not be reflected in the reports that we send back to New York, but this is tactically happening in the field. So it's challenging when it comes to this, but again, this is where the experience from the team leader comes in, because these are the things that you don't have to be given a written instruction. This is something that comes out of you. How do you handle this? So team leader has a responsibility to apportion different roles. You may say, okay, since when you come with us, they're not comfortable, stay in the vehicle. You'll be giving report back to the headquarters, to the base. Then we're going to make interaction. Then you solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other last question? Yes.
Thank you. No question, but just 2 short comments. I'm Gino Micale. I'm a Major General of Carabinieri and a military and police advisor of the Italian mission. Thank you for your briefing. And I'm really happy to underline the very strong cooperation with the police division that here is with his deputy police advisor. The comments are, the first is refer to the work of Dr. Hunt that I read with great interest. In one of the chapters, you talk about the holistic approach, and you mean the justice and correction in particular. I think that this concept must be much wider, because this protection of civilian is strictly connected with the community police that we just yesterday with my friend of police advisor, we joined our monthly meeting, and one of the topics was the community policing, and this issue must be included in a wider concept, because all the police activity on the field must be endorsed by economic, social, and all other institutional development. Otherwise, could be very useful to approach a law enforcement activity in the field. And I want to add what my friend Boniface has told related with the experience and the skill of the official in the field. It's true, but if we should have only very old official, very experienced official, and I think that our skill, it's only a part of our history. So, and we have to consider that all the community policing activity are a long-term activity. So must be intended in a long time. And I want to conclude my short comments. In Rome, I am a Carabinieri. Obviously, I'm really proud of my corps. I want to tell a short story. In '43, in Rome, there was the famous, unfortunately, raid of the Jewish ghetto in Rome. 1 week before this operation, 2,000 of Carabinieri were arrested and deported in concentration camp because due to their close to the population, they were considered an obstacle to the conduct of the operation. Also, this is a small example that tells how must be interpreted the community policing, the closeness with the population. That is not a played, is not a simple to play a role. Must be interpreted as an heartfelt, not simply. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these important points and for sharing this with us. If there are no final comments from panelists, I think it's time. Yes, Charlie. That's why I said that.
Sorry, I can't help it. I think they were great points. I couldn't agree more with you about the idea of a wider concept, and it comes back a little bit to Wesley's question earlier. If criminal justice reform and focusing on the rule of law is an important part of what missions are beginning to put in place, because there's a big question about what the limits of peacekeeping should be, what the limits of what UNPOL can do in this context. But nevertheless, if they're part of laying down the foundations and putting in place what could become a path dependency, then we need to think bigger about what those beginnings are part of, because security sector reform, security system reform, as some of the more enlightened work on this talks about it as, is a governance logic. It's about what makes resilient societies, what will lead to sustainable peace. It's not just about technical building of capacities and capabilities of police to have a physical presence. So we need to think bigger, I agree, but with that caveat that what we should ask peacekeeping and police within peace operations to do needs to be seriously, carefully considered, because the risk of overstretching and asking too much of the police could lead to risk as well. The last thing I'll say is something, pick up on what Xiaoen said rightly, the global focal point, I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's a really promising development. I think it's exactly the right idea about focusing on how to coordinate better, how to bring the system's strengths and leverage that together. But I think there's plenty more to be done, and the role of other parts of the UN system, so DPPA, as well as governing transitions around with the country team, thinking through longer time horizons and having realistic expectations of what can be achieved in the short term is critical to this. But thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. It's always very difficult to close such rich conversations, and I hope actually that Charlie's report will be just the beginning of a larger conversation on peacekeeping, the link to peace building and sustaining peace and transitions as well. But I think today's discussion was extremely useful, and all panelists provided practical insights, practical recommendations, practical experiences regarding the comparative advantages of UNPOL and how we should actually strengthen the engagement of member states in clarifying the scope and meaning of their contribution to POC, providing more appropriate resources, revising some policy documents and guidance documents and structures as well at the UN. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming to this policy forum. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion today.